When a director and a composer strike gold together with their first project, it often marks the beginning of a recurrent collaboration, born of a mutual creative respect, trust, and admiration for one another's work. These loyal pairings are omnipresent throughout film's history and remain prominent in this new school of film music composition, where popular music artists have been invited into the film composition space, bringing with them a new, often non-classical sonic language to enhance these modern cinematic stories. One of the more prominent of these pairings is that of writer-director Alex Garland with Geoff Barrow and Ben Salisbury. In less than 10 years, having worked together on Ex Machina, Devs, Men, Civil War, and of course, Annihilation. The alternative musical sensibilities of many of these producer-composers are often paired with quite alternative or indie sensibilities in the filmmaking. In combination, a perfect opportunity for novel and unique world building.
Unfathomable mind.
As a writer, Garland had already established his own creative pairing with director Danny Boyle. In 2000, Garland's first novel, The Beach, saw a screen adaptation directed by Boyle, where the novel's tense narrative and Boyle's genre-hopping stylisms helped set the tone for what would become their own recurrent collaboration between writer and director. Garland went on to pen screenplays for a number of Danny Boyle's follow-ups, most recently returning for the hugely anticipated 28 Years Later. Garland's writing of 2012's Dread and subsequent heavy involvement in the post-production process almost saw him attain a co-director credit for that film, but his official directorial debut came with 2014's Ex Machina, another of his own screenplays. An equally tense but entirely cerebral story about the ethics of artificial general intelligence and its potential to emotionally manipulate and intellectually outrank mankind. Following some musical assistance from Barrow for the unfortunately unused score for Dread, and its subsequent standalone release in conjunction with Ben Salisbury, it was here where their musical partnership began in that more conventional sense. But the music they've produced together thus far is far from conventional. While Salisbury was a composer of predominantly orchestral TV music for a number of years beforehand, Barrow was a founding member of alternative electronic experimental band Portishead. This duality of influence is hugely significant for their signature and the subsequent appropriateness for many of the strange and hyper-real narratives they're asked to compose for. Their close working relationship with Garland permitted a longer composition process on Ex Machina that began at the script stage. Here, if granted the precious time to do so, a composer or composers are able to ruminate on its themes and concepts before their eventual musical transmutation to picture. And this privilege of time was also granted to them for Ex Machina's follow-up, Annihilation, based on Jeff Vandermeer's book of the same name. It's the story of the latest in a string of failed expeditions into the mysterious Area X, a militarily restricted area whose epicenter, a lighthouse in coastal Florida, seems to be the origin of this area's growing boundary, known as the Shimmer, which blocks communications in and out. This new all-female expedition is comprised of scientists, medics, and in the case of protagonist Lena, the wife of the only known survivor of the previous expedition, who mysteriously materializes in their home over a year later after disappearing, though admittedly he's not there for very long.
Stay with me.
What the fuck?
A psychologist, Dr. Ventress, part of the organization who is running these expeditions, known as the Southern Reach, is also in attendance, as yet unsure of the origins of this event and whose motivations for joining the expedition are duplicitous. As we later learn, her terminal illness feeds into these motivations, which are indicative of a deeper theme in the film of self-destruction or self-annihilation, one which Barrow and Salisbury's score more than touches upon. Barrow and Salisbury took a largely ambient approach in scoring for Ex Machina, with the score leaning more into atmospheric soundscapes and synth-heavy textures and drones than any overtly melodic writing. This style of writing was well in vogue by 2014 due to a number of atmospheric from ambience scores in the preceding years, like Cliff Martinez's collaborations with Nicholas Winding Refn, or his slightly more orchestral approach with Steven Soderbergh, or even farther back with Michael Mann's collaborations with Elliot Goldenthal, the Kronos Quartet, and even Tangerine Dream, with their early pioneering synth work for Thief. They all call upon a notion of ambience to signify atmosphere through both classical and electronic spheres, but its stylistic fashionability is matched by the suitability for the narratives that it's most successful in accompanying. The introspective, the meditative, cerebral subject matter, usually of science fiction cinema, and more generally across genre lines, anything slow, suspenseful, and atmospheric. But equal to narrative is the emotional range it's able to convey. In Ex Machina alone, its more ambient sensibilities are able to evoke lonely melancholy,
Like Nathan.
a reverence of beauty, and menace, to name but a few.
Caleb.
To be broad, both spheres of electronic and classical music have had ambient movements of sorts. Modern Western composers have explored an almost transgressive refrain from melody or harmonic complexity since the 19th century. Here with Erik Satie's Gymnopédie, and his later work Musique de Meublement, or furniture music, conceived quite literally to be played in the background. Non-melodic composition and further deconstruction of previously fundamental musical compositional principles continued post-war. Composers like Morton Feldman, whose frequent focus on resonance and chordal sustains over challengingly long periods of time, gave us examples of what we now might think of in hindsight as ambience in composition, which were then pioneered and progressed in the electronic space by producers and composers like Brian Eno. Post-rock groups like Mogwai or Sigur Rós have explored ambience through the lens and instrumentation of the guitar band. The latter, along with outfits like Stars of the Lid, coming full circle via classical, predominantly string instrumentation. Modern post-internet offshoots like dark ambient or some subgenres of vaporwave continue to innovate around these atmospheric lines, conjuring much of its affect through allusions to nostalgia for the bygone, both real and vicarious. Ambient music's ability to affect in the filmic context may be, despite its relative sparseness, it's still able to convey harmony and tonality information, much the same as more melodically complex music. Ergo, it's able to still carry chordal information. But particularly for Annihilation or films with similar conceptual considerations, ambient music qualities are suitable on a number of levels, and maybe why Barrow's earlier resentment of Portishead's occasional association with the ambient music movement of the early mid-90s doesn't seem to apply so much to his cinematic music's association with a sense of ambience through his collaborations with Salisbury. Its extended sustained chords with infrequent modulation and use of drones are able to create a meditative or trance-like state of awareness or non-awareness, particularly when considering the connotation of non-Western drone-based music in meditative and spiritual practices that center around various instrumental drones. Our protagonists awaken with a dissociated sense of time.
We've been out here for at least 3 or 4 days.
Maybe weeks.
We were inside for nearly 4 months.
And as explained in the novel, at least, this may be an intentional use of hypnosis on the part of Ventress. So a degree of ambience here may signify a meditative or hypnotic dissociation of sorts. This atemporal nature of ambience is able to describe huge expanses of time rendered fleeting, or the most ephemeral moments stretched out to infinity via super slow motion. At its core, the physical property of sustain in ambient music is simply the maintenance of sonority over time. On the effectiveness of ambience as an atmospheric and suspense-generating tool in Mica Levi's score for Jonathan Glazer's Under the Skin, Rick Warner remarks, "The score can be classified as ambient in terms of music genre, but this genre, even when it lacks a supplementing image, is more than sonic. It is environmental." In the liner notes for his album Music for Airports, Brian Eno famously defines ambient as an atmosphere or a surrounding influence that makes it conducive to thought and contemplation, founded in slowness, receptivity, and the ambiguities of what is outside and what is inside. When this music isn't produced as barely varying electronica that pacifies, it shudders on the brink of anxious commotion. Ambient's frequent disregard for rigid structural rules also allows it to map perfectly over the cuts and edits of moving image in a beautifully organic and fluid way, whereas more structured or metered music requires much more intentionality and synchronicity to picture through more opaque time signature or tempo changes. Ambient music, like its namesake, ambient sound, particularly from synthesized sources with its theoretically infinite resonances, has a diegetic association as well, where infinitely sustained notes can be seen to mimic weather, like wind or rain or other environmental properties. For Annihilation, where so much of our subject matter is the literal observance of the environment around us and how it's being changed, the music can intrinsically meld into the environmental visuals and the environmental sound in equal measure, where any musical descriptions of this environmental change then symbiotically enhances the vividness of the visuals that we're seeing. It's a concept of interdiegesis we touched on in episode 3 for Arrival, so go watch that. In the film's opening, we see that the shimmer is actually the result of an extraterrestrial event, and we're immediately introduced to the notion of cell division and mutation as being a central component to the narrative, one which has a great deal of influence on how the music is constructed. Reflecting this physical destruction are themes of internal self-destruction, where all of the characters are experiencing huge psychological or existential struggles, having signed up for the expedition as a search for meaning, solace, or escape.
Volunteering for this, it's not exactly something you do if your life is in perfect harmony.
And these internal pains, like Lena's guilt over her husband, are mirrored or echoed in various doublings in the shimmer's environment.
Duplicates of form,
Duplicates.
echoes.
The dividing effects of the shimmer are described in the film as being like that of a prism, where light is refracted into multiple beams. Only the shimmer is doing this to their DNA.
The shimmer is a prism, but it refracts everything. Not just light and radio waves. Animal DNA, plant DNA, all DNA.
This splitting and mutation is ingrained in the score on both a compositional arrangement level and also a production and sound design level. The prevalence of female voices in the score has a very direct significance for this all-female expedition. Initially, they sing unison doublings, which then deviate away from one another, meandering around each other. It reflects the corruption of their splitting cells, and indeed the characters then branching off onto their own paths, ultimately splitting into copies like the cells themselves. Not to mention the presence of dissonant, sustained, clustered voices in the filmic context, having a now intrinsic association with cosmic horror, thanks to Kubrick's now iconic use of the second movement of Ligoti's Requiem. These meanderings happen in the string choir too. Initially it plays these droning perfect fifth chords in unison, swelling in and out, having a breath-like or organic quality, but get quite ominous in their dynamic performance, particularly as they approach the shimmer, to signify that impending danger in their expedition. Initially quite organic sounding, it's doubled with a slightly metallic sounding synth texture, slightly buried in the mix, signifying a covertly underlying unknown. Later on, as they penetrate further into the shimmer and its corrupting influence is having more of an effect on them, these droning swells start to become pitch warped, much like the vocals, being pitch bent in a subtle but significant way, with kind of electronic character, almost like a MIDI pitch bend or an analog synth that hasn't yet fully warmed up. When they discover the remains of the previous expedition, the shimmer's corrupting influence is at its weirdest and most shocking, where strings and brass together are now at their most dissonant and unrestrained, borrowing those classical tropes but with an alien edge through those tone clusters and aleatoric sounding glissandi. It's reminiscent of avant-garde, aleatoric, sonoristic composers like Penderecki, Lutosławski, and again Ligeti, particularly his work Atmospheres. This, Kubrick's other Ligeti placement from 2001, has had influence on countless cinematic alien encounters since that film. Barrow and Salisbury, wherever they can, inject their now signature electronic backing amongst these modernist orchestral influences. Effects used in the production of this audio also cleverly mirror these narrative aspects of cell division and annihilation. Not only is distortion used on the orchestral elements, a quite literal translation of corruption of the organic, modulation effects are also used liberally, like chorus, flanging, and phasing. As a very loose description of modulation effects, in itself quite an umbrella term. These effects are achieved when a sound wave is doubled and its synchronicity with the original or its phase is modulated or detuned. Sound familiar? The interference of these waveforms is then either constructive or destructive based on that phase. This results in a kind of pulsating of perceived volume, or if modulated at a high enough frequency, kind of dreamlike undulation. This doubling and detuning is that metaphorical prism in action, even if only subconsciously utilized by Barrow and Salisbury, splitting off a copy and augmenting it. When these effects are then used in stereo or surround, the doubled sound waves are panned oppositely, filling the soundstage, becoming incredibly immersive and enveloping on an almost psychoacoustic level. A musical dichotomy of human or organic as acoustic instrumentation, contrasted with the unknown as an electronic other, is a trope in film as old as music technology itself. Brunn and Hart call upon Bakhtin's term of musical heteroglossia to describe Annihilation's amalgam of layers of different musical genres and instrumental sound worlds in complex constellations. Barrow and Salisbury played it relatively safe on an instrumentational level on Ex Machina, gravitating more towards electronics for its largely technologically oriented narrative. But even then they brought in some more organic textures and instrumentation to inject some delicate humanity into Ava's otherwise robotic character. In Annihilation, this humanity is partly provided by the acoustic guitar line played like Lena in Isolation. It It's stylistically closely associative with one of the film's soundtrack placements, an emotional folk rock tune by Crosby, Stills and Nash called Helplessly Hoping.
Helplessly hoping her harlequin hovers nearby, awaiting a word.
It acts as an emotional tether to the relationship she's grieving in Kane's inexplicable absence, and plays in the scene when he returns to her. But as a piece of music, which is arguably Americana adjacent, it also kind of becomes aesthetically scene setting through a wider cultural association between Americana music and Americana as a geographical or aesthetic setting. But in the opening cue, this lone guitar line placed in isolation amongst swirling, shimmering electronics is much like Lena and the expedition amongst their surroundings within the shimmer. And that guitar-oriented allusion to their humanity gets less and less frequent as their humanity, both cellular and psychological, is literally being annihilated and changed. But as well as Lena and the expedition as lone human figures around a surrounding unknown, there's also the aspect of the lone alien surrounded by a nature unknown to it. Eerily manipulated metallophones like the waterphone are representative of an exotic other trying to coincide with its unknown surroundings. These metallic textures allude to non-Western metallophones like the gamelan or singing bowls, which don't conform to the traditional Western 12-tone equal temperament, so have an atonal or microtonal kind of foreign quality. Their indifference to the surrounding tonality, and indeed internally within its own harmonic resonances relationship with its fundamental frequency, are perfectly emblematic of the alien's indifference to the nature that it's corrupting. A simultaneity of incompatible constituent parts intersecting with one another. As Ventress says,
I don't know what it wants. Or if it wants, it's not like us.
the slow degradation of predominantly organic or acoustically derived textures, their technological affectations, and their eventual supersession by electronic music in the film's climax is an example of the hyper-orchestra at work. Annihilation exemplifies this through a melding of the electronic other and organic instruments that push the otherwise acoustically derived music into a hyper-real state. No longer are organic and electronic held distinctly from one another, but in reverse almost to the film's splitting cells motif, the two distinct aspects are merged into a sonic superposition. The blending of electronic synthesis with more traditional orchestral textures creates a kind of liminal space in which neither can be fully identified. Perfect representation of the shimmer. As a side note, this relationship is achieved more prescriptively through sound design, most notably during the bear attack, where the bear's roar and Shepard's preserved dying consciousness bellow out in a symbiotic, tortured cry. The gradual intensification of these amalgamations allow the music to behave like an organic structure, mirroring the biological and, importantly, psychological transformations and coalescences happening in the characters, and indeed, by this point, in the audience to some degree. The musical conjuring of this hyperreality allows both audience and characters to then share this liminal space. This all culminates in Lena's arrival at the lighthouse and her interfacing with Ventress and the alien, or at least a perceivable representation of it. In what is, to me at least, Garland's Kubrickian Stargate sequence, we see the fullest manifestation of this cell division in the birth of Lena's doppelganger and Barrow and Salisbury's most distinct opus, aptly titled The Alien. As Lena enters the lighthouse, the flanged texture builds as she approaches what we believe to be Ventress, or perhaps a double, with her cryptic ramblings. The hyperreality of this musical gesture mirrors the visuals. The walls of the chamber, like liquid itself, constructing a hyperreal visual space. The droning string sustains with their slow pitch bends intensify, now joined by this minimal motif of a second, fourth and minor third swirling around the sound field, perhaps foreshadowing the splitting off we're about to witness. Ventress is literally annihilated. Basses and celli then played the most overtly chordal movement of the score so far. through a minor third to seventh to second, minor sixth to fourth, where we stay temporarily suspended on that fourth and in perfect cadence. The string drones from before are in themselves now annihilated into their most electronically affected iteration. Their whirring, flanged resonances taking on a wholly artificial character for the revelation of the alien's form. The suspended fourth fades out, and we momentarily leave the alien cue altogether in favour of a soundtrack placement. A track called The Mark Interlude by Moderat, in itself another meeting of minds between electronic powerhouses, Mode Selector and Apparat. This largely ambient track with a constant sustained chord, almost like a frozen reverb tail, appropriately suspended in midair, beautifully accompanies the visual form of the floating alien orb. The visual itself is a Mandelbulb, or a 3D representation of a higher dimensional Mandelbrot set, which is a type of fractal, which in the most basic sense is a mathematical shape infinitely comprised of itself. The closer you observe the shape, the more patterns you see repeating within it ad infinitum, like a snowflake, but trippy. Terrifying. The track completely fills the soundstage with no Foley, as the audio representation of this infinite shape within itself becomes all-encompassing in Lena's and our consciousness. The only exception being that of Lena's breath, which at this point may as well be our breath sharing that space. But as the droplet of her blood enters, and the requirement for ominousness returns, so does Barrow and Salisbury's alien cue, with its harsh, nearly painful bandpass filtered synth. The whirring flange effect accompanies the visual of the cell splitting, solidifying the connotation between them, as Lena's double materializes in a humanoid form. But the sound of the splitting cells in the music is now no longer panned, but directly in the center channel, where traditionally dialogue and other diegetic sound would come from, making this sonically enhanced, visceral cell division something that is happening squarely within Lena and our POV. Its disturbingly human movement towards her is mimicked in the alien's now signature electronic derivation in the score. The synth taking on a terrifyingly vocal-like quality. It could almost be diegetic, the alien trying to speak and interface with Lena, its language as incomprehensible as its motivations. Organic instrumentation is all but gone here as we are subsumed by electronics and the spectacle of the alien's new form. The return of the dissonant female vocal split motif returns underscore their intimate dance with one another, as Lena manipulates the alien into accepting the phosphorus grenade. Perhaps for the first and last time, we feel some sympathy for the creature as it finally takes on Lena's full appearance and presents a defeated look of despair or tragic, almost innocent non-understanding. Our human drive to self-annihilate has malignantly been copied onto the alien like Ventress's cancer. We and our motivations are as alien to it as it is to us. And the cue swells in the almost sadness of this moment, the same F-sharp major 7 chord we heard earlier in the Moderat track. Now, both track and cue are in B-flat minor, both moving between the tonic and submediant chord, and this, along with the similar vocal-like quality of the bass synth in each, is, I think, indicative that Moderat's track was a fundamental anchor point for the inspiration for the film's soundtrack, its intended use potentially preceding the score, with the composition of the alien cue before and after, opposed to transition in and out fluidly. Indeed, this track likely became the reason for the score's overall tonality and much of its harmonic language, and at the very least is massively influential on the construction of the bass synths in the alien cue. Whether it's the alien's appropriation of Ventress's cancer, or the strategic placement of Lena's phosphorus grenade, or indeed just an inherited human ability to self-annihilate, the alien and its corrupting shimmer finally succumb and crumble away. We slowly meld back into an unaffected, organic-sounding string drone, with no more electronic or pitch embellishments, as all remnants of the aliens' presence, both visually and in the score, are finally disintegrated, though admittedly not for very long. Annihilation has a completely unique sound world. Both film and score blur into a hyper-real superposition of a familiar and an alien to make something entirely new and distinct from its component parts, and indeed what's come before it. It mirrors the deeply interwoven creative outlook of Garland with Barrow and Salisbury, with each repeated collaboration creating new and totally immersive experiences. Their music is less a layer placed on top of the film and more something that grows out of it. The combination of organic ambience, corrupted with electronic manipulation, perfectly captured a sonic interpretation of the shimmer's prism effect. It's a perfect example of how this new school of film composition, channeling classical tropes, but with constant innovation from the hyper-orchestral, hold allegiances to concepts, not mere narrative and tone. This is a huge aspect of how Barrow and Salisbury are able to shape the music which guides our understanding of what we're seeing on screen, in ways that are often felt as well as heard. So thank you so much for checking out this essay on the score of Annihilation. In a few weeks, I'll be posting my recreation of the cue, the swimming pool, from around the halfway mark in the film. It's where things get pretty creepy and weird. There's lots of cool string pitch bends and some analog synth work. So as always, come back and check that out. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe. Ding the bell for notifications so you don't miss any future essays or any of my mock-ups. As always, drop a comment, head over to Instagram, let me know what films you want to see covered in future. I'm always open to suggestions. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in part 2.